Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. This is season 13, episode 5. Today, I'm very happy to be talking to podcaster Vanessa Baca. Vanessa is a cook, food blogger, podcaster, freelance writer, and public relations professional. Her food blog, Food and Books, reviews various works of literature and recreates the food references in these books. Her podcast, Cooking the Books, showcases literary cuisine with a variety of guests. I know her mainly from her podcast, Fear Feasts, which she does with previous guest Alessandra Pino. I'm a huge fan of that podcast, and I listen to every episode the day it comes out because I can't wait for it to come out. It comes out bi-weekly, and I'm always waiting for each episode with bated breath. I really love the conversations that Vanessa and Alessandra have about food in books and how they usually will compare the written versions of the books, and then also compare that to what's on the films as well. So that is very well done. Without further ado, I'll take you to my conversation with the wonderful Vanessa Baca.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's wonderful to hear your voice. I've been such a
Thank
fan of
you.
yours.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your support.
I love the podcast so much. I look forward to it
Thank you.
every other week. I wait for it and wait for it, and it's something that gives me a very large amount of pleasure. I think it's my absolute favorite podcast.
Oh my gosh, that guy, that's the best compliment I've gotten. Thank you so much for saying that. It's a labor of love for Ellie and I, that's for sure. We love it so much.
I almost actually even feel like it's made just for me. Because I mean, the topics you guys cover, some of
Yeah.
my favorite films, and I'm just like, do they somehow get intel and find things that only
Well,
I
now you
like? And
know. Now you
I,
know we have a secret spy network.
yeah, is my wife sending you information through email and
Right?
everything?
Well, no, that makes me so happy to hear. We work very hard on it, and it's like I said, it's something that I think is near and dear to both of our hearts. So I'm happy to know that our efforts are that other people appreciate our efforts.
We must have a huge fan base. I mean, I can't be the only one.
We're building fan base. I don't know how huge it is, but we actually just hit 500 listens to the podcast. So I thought that was pretty good in less than a year. I'm pretty proud of what we've accomplished. So I think it's just a matter of, it's hard because there are so many podcasts out there. And
Yes.
I do feel that ours are unique. Ours is unique because we take two things that I don't think many people would consider have a connection. But to me, I think food and horror are two universal connectors because everybody has to eat to live and everybody's afraid of something, whatever that might be. So to me, it's a logical connection, but maybe not for everybody else.
Well, I think, there are a lot of other horror podcasts, but some of them are
Hmm.
kind of done by meatheads. I'm not trying to be mean, but like, some of them are kind of just these dude bros.
Hmm.
And I'm like, I'm not a dude bro kind of guy. I don't want to hear the dude bros.
Yeah, yeah.
I like
And
something a little bit more.
horror is, I think, such a subjective thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, much like food, like what somebody thinks is scary, maybe somebody else doesn't think is scary. Like for me, I don't really find like gross horror. I don't think it's scary at all. I think it's kind of silly in some ways. Some of it can be well done, but I think like the sort of franchises like Saw, for example, I never was into it because to me it isn't scary. Scary to
Yeah.
me is when you're genuinely terrified and when you're terrified by something that you don't necessarily see on screen. That to me is well done horror.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's almost like you're just basically creating PTSD for yourself. And that's not fun. I don't enjoy
No,
that.
no, nor I. There's enough things in real life to give you PTSD. You don't need, I don't personally need to find it in my films.
Well, if you compare it to the Dr. Phibes films, which is kind of the same premise in a way,
Hmm.
the Dr. Phibe films were fun. It was stylish, and the people when they died was never realistic. It was always kind of corny, very much
Yeah,
like a British panto kind of
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Wink, wink.
Hmm. I know
Theater of
exactly
Blood,
what you mean.
all that stuff where, the revenge killings, but it was always kind of done masterfully. Whereas this is just a
Hmm.
gross out thing, I just want to see how
Yeah.
much you can possibly take.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I feel the same. I mean, that being said, I mean, there is one movie that does have quite a lot of gore in it, but I love it. And I don't even think it is horror, but to me, it's as much satire as it is anything else. So I watch it and I think it's just really kind of funny. It's American Psycho. And I love the
Yeah.
book by Bret Easton Ellis, and I love the movie with I forget the actor's name. But yes, it's
Christian Bale, yeah.
Christian Bale, thank you, who's been in some other fantastic horror films. But to me, that one is funny in its gore precisely because it is meant to be satirical and it's meant to kind of point out the flaws in our society at that time. This sort of concept of white toxic manhood in corporate America. And it's really funny. I think it's really hilarious. And so people kind of think I'm weird when I tell them I think that's a hilarious film, even though it's gross and it is horror. But what can I say? Horror is subjective.
Well, I think when it came out, people were saying that it
Hmm.
was meant to be a satire, and people were not
Yeah.
picking that up at all.
No, no. And same thing with the book. The book was demonized and villainized for many, many years. And it's such a well-written book. I don't get it. But again, subjective, like we were saying.
We have a problem in this country, and maybe others, but we don't really get satire. Um,
No, sadly.
yeah, and I see that a lot as a librarian. People are like, "This book offended me," and it's like, well, it was meant to be offensive,
Hmm.
so job well
Because
done.
it's meant to point out things that need to be critically examined in our
Yeah.
society. That's the point of satire.
Now I have to point out for the
Mhm.
listeners right now, your kitchen is gorgeous. Talk to me about
Thank
this
you.
kitchen. I love it. It's beautiful and
Thank
red, so much
you.
red.
Thank you. I love red. You would think that it would be black with goth stuff everywhere, but no.
No, I'm not. I mean, I understand that.
Hmm.
You would think that with me as well, but I tend to not always go that because I don't know. You can't
Yeah.
do that all the time.
Yeah. Well, I love the color red. To me, it's very uplifting. So yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I had a good time painting it and getting it all to my style.
Well, I've had all black, and if your vision starts failing as you get older, it's not a fun thing because you can't find anything. It's all black.
No, right. That's one of the drawbacks of being a goth that nobody ever tells you about.
Yeah, like where's my shirt? I had it on. Oh,
Right?
it's you're like feeling around.
Uh-huh.
You,
Exactly.
you need
Oh,
a
that's
guide
funny.
dog.
Hilarious.
Vanessa, so tell me about where are you from? Talk to me about your childhood. Did you have a love of food as in your childhood? Talk to me about that a little bit.
Yeah. I was born here in New Mexico in the southwest of the United States. I still live here in Albuquerque. I was raised primarily by my maternal grandmother, who was a wonderful cook. Um, and so I very early memories of her making fresh tortillas, which is really kind of a lost art within our culture. She was a wonderful cook, a phenomenal cook, but she was one of those people who were very impatient as well. So I didn't actually learn to cook from her because I would want to learn from her. And I wouldn't get it right on the first try. And she would just say, well, never mind, let me do it. And she would do it. And so sadly, I didn't grow up with that knowledge of cooking, but I'm a foodie. I love food. I started getting into cooking probably in my late 20s, early 30s, right around the time that the Food Network was coming out. And a big, huge influence on me has been Nigella Lawson, the British
Oh
cook.
yeah.
Remember watching her very first cooking show. And I thought she was just so beautiful and amazing. But yet, they showed her in her home with her kids. And her house was lovely, but it wasn't necessarily like this super fancy house. It was messy sometimes. And she was kind of she cooked in kind of the way, like you could tell she had a lot of enjoyment in it. She would
Yeah.
taste as she went along. And she was obviously also very literary, which I thought was so wonderful. She would make these literary allusions and comparisons to different books she had read or whatever. And I just thought that was so amazing. It's not something that I had really ever put together in my head, but I've read since an early age. I love to read, and I got very into cooking. So that was sort of maybe in a way like a germ of how my blog and subsequent podcasts have come into being.
I love her writing as well as her
Hmm.
TV shows
Yes.
because she's a very good writer and she has a definite sense of prose in her
Hmm.
writing,
Hmm.
which I love. I mean, I love her talking about anything, but when she writes, it's very beautiful
Hmm.
to read her work. I
It is.
really can't talk about her writing enough because I recommend her books a lot in the library,
Hmm.
and I always say you need to really read her work because
Hmm.
it's worth reading. Um,
Agreed.
so did you have any relatives that kind of you mentioned your grandmother a
Hmm.
little bit. What were some of the foods that you had your family cooking growing up?
Well, like I had mentioned, my grandmother was she made tortillas. She was very good at it. Like I said, it's becoming kind of a lost art within our culture. My dad
Yeah,
loved to cook. He made eggplant parmigiana. I always remember that was the thing he loved, and he made it quite a bit. He passed away when I was 15, so I
I'm
think
sorry.
he would have, thank you. I think he would have continued to be a big influence in my life, cooking wise. He certainly was a huge influence literary wise because he would carry books with him all over, and that's how I would discover books. That's how I discovered Stephen King. You know, talking about a love of horror. My dad had a copy of the book The Shining in his car. I think it was about 9 or 10, and of course I took it and read it and bugged him for a week with questions about it. Yeah, so my mostly my maternal grandmother. My mother was a very good cook as well. We weren't quite as close, but she was a very good cook as well, extremely good cook. But again, another very impatient person, so I didn't get a
Yeah.
chance to learn too much from either her or my grandmother. So, unfortunately, the cooking of our New Mexico culture is not, it's not something that's instinctive to me, which I feel kind of sad about. But I'm learning it as I get older. But I sort of had to develop my own taste palette, and then I've done that as an adult. And I feel like I'm a very good cook, but it's not the traditional cooking that I grew up with. Like pinto beans was a real big thing. We weren't very wealthy, so we had to eat kind of basic things, beans and potatoes and tortillas and I still to this day can't make an omelet because my grandmother would lose patience with me because I could never master the omelet flip. So to this day, something that's as basic as an omelet, I still can't really make it. It's always runny in the middle. So I just cheat and I make a frittata instead, and that always comes out perfect. And I just lie and I'm like, oh yeah, it's my type of an omelet. It's an Italian omelet. Yeah. And people are like, oh, look at you, you're gourmet. I'm like, I'm such a gourmet. That's right.
I love that.
It's all sleight of hand. Trust me.
There's been a lot of talk recently about the food in New Mexico.
Hmm.
Linda Rodstadt wrote a book that came out this year, Feels Like Home, A Song of the Sonoran Borderlands. Did you
Hmm.
get a chance to read that at all? It's a wonderful book.
No, no, I haven't. I have not. I've heard of it, but I have not. I have not read it. I believe Linda Ronstadt is her family was originally from Arizona, and the food there is somewhat different. It's like kind of the difference between Texan Tex-Mex food and New Mexico food.
Yeah.
I mean, they're similar in some ways, but there's certain things that are very specific to the food in the New Mexico culture that you don't really see anyplace else.
Yeah. I mean, I've been in Mexico and it's
Hmm.
a different region. There's nothing like it in the United States.
No.
It's very singular.
Hmm.
Talk to me about your love of horror. When did it start with you? You mentioned your father having Stephen King's The Shining. Did it begin
Hmm.
there, or did you get to watch other films growing up?
It was mainly from reading. I was never a huge film fan. I do like a lot of horror in films, but I tend to be much more book focused. I think probably having read Stephen King from just a very young age, and I think King for people of my age in particular, when you kind of he sort of was the seminal writer for kids like me who were
Yeah.
into more of the darker things in life. Yeah, I mean, it's The Shining, Salem's Lot. That's a movie I remember seeing when I was quite young, and to this day, that scene where the vampire is floating outside the kid's room,
Yeah.
man, that scarred me for many many years. But it scarred me in the sense that like I had to have more. I remember seeing The Exorcist when I was quite young, probably too young.
Oh
Um,
my God, that must have messed
or
you up bad.
well, we were Catholic, and so I think that was sort of the mentality behind it is, well, it's okay because it's about priest saving a little girl. And but yeah, I remember that movie was terrifying, and it's funny because it's one of my favorite movies to this day. I don't find it necessarily terrifying anymore because I've seen it too many times, but I find it fascinating just as a kind of a psychological analysis, a police procedural. It's a wonderfully done book and movie. I liked Dean Koontz when I was growing up. I liked R.L. Stein. So probably the what you would expect, like a kid growing up who had a taste for the dark and the goth. And then as I got older, I discovered Anne Rice, whom I adore. May she rest. I don't know that I would classify her as horror. She takes horror
No.
tropes, but she's to me she's literature. She's
Yeah.
just an absolutely incredible writer. I don't think her vampires, they're not scary. They're very elegant and quite seductive. Her books to me are not horrifying, but they're incredibly well written and they're beautiful. And she does use a lot of horror tropes, ghosts, witches, vampires, haunted houses, and I did love all that. To me, she's more of a gothic writer than
Yeah.
maybe necessarily a horror writer. Yeah. Now probably more modern horror literature that I've gotten into. There's a writer, he's from Great Britain, F.G. Cottam, letter F, letter G, and then Cottam, Cottam.
Oh,
He's, and I don't know why he's not more widely read. He has written so many. I have all of his books, and I think he's just an absolutely amazing writer. I keep telling Allie, my podcast partner, she lives in London. I'm like, you got to find him, go stalk him and get him on our show. He's just a wonderful, wonderful writer. He wrote a book called The House of Lost Souls, which I believe was his first book. And I was hooked. And to me, he's one of some of the younger horror writers now, like Grady Hendrix, who I think is
yeah.
phenomenal. Jason Arnott is another great writer. To me, they are the writers who kind of have, now in the modern times, have taken those traditional horror tropes and sort of have recreated them. Like Grady Hendrix. I think if you're into horror, you know who Grady Hendrix is.
Yeah.
Grady Hendrix has taken the concept of vampires and kind of giving it a fresh new twist, and the concept of a haunted house and spooky dolls and things like that. And but he's funny too. He's got this very witty Southern sense of humor, and I think part of why he particularly reminds me a lot of King is because he's also not afraid to get into the gruesome stuff. Like some of Stephen King stuff, it's you got to have a strong stomach to read it. And that's how Grady Hendrix is. He can write some very gruesome scenes. So, ironically, with my love of food and horror, I always say don't read Grady Hendrix while you're eating.
I've only read one of his books, and it was recently. It was How to Sell a
Mhm.
Haunted House. Have
Yes.
you read that?
Oh, yes. I've read all
Y-
his books.
Do you have any dolls?
No, not anymore.
Are you going to buy any now?
No, 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 no. We had dolls growing up, and they're all at my sister's house now. I refuse to have them in my house. The dolls scare the hell out of me.
Or puppets?
Mm-mm. Nope. No
See,
puppets, no dolls.
I have some, and I wanted to get a ventriloquist dummy, but I've been told no bueno, that's not happening.
So I assume you probably love the movie Magic with Anthony Hopkins then.
I do. I still
Hmm.
think it stands out. It's a good
Hmm.
film, and he was magnificent in it.
He really was. He really was. Yeah, that's a movie I saw many years ago with my dad, and I'm like to this day scarred. I'm like, I can't. But it's something that Allie and I are going to cover in upcoming seasons of Fear Feasts. So I guess I'm going to
Oh,
have to watch it
nice.
again. Hmm.
I do love the fact that you, and we'll talk more about the podcast later as well, but I love the fact that you highlight a lot of horror films of the 70s, which is, I think, my favorite era for horror films because
Hmm.
I really love, I think, maybe from my childhood watching
Hmm.
them, but you do great service to them, I think that, and I think it's wonderful that somebody's doing that because you don't
Thank
often hear
you.
that from people.
Thank you so much. Well, I really do think it was a very important time in filmmaking. It was just a few years after there were so many restrictions on what could be in actual films, and I think that's reflective. But I also think you see a lot of reflections of what was going on in society at the time. We were just barely coming out of the Vietnam War. There was
Yeah.
a lot of political unrest. There was a lot of racial tensions, and it kind of is a lot like what we're dealing with now. And I think horror, if nothing else, provides a backdrop to show what's going on in culture and society at the time. And if it's done right, it can be kind of timeless.
So let's talk about food and books.
Mhm.
When did you start that, and what kind of got you spurred to start the blog?
I started the Food and Books blog in 2016. It was really born out of just I started noticing in the trajectory of my reading that I was noticing the food references because I was really developing my cooking skills at the time. And I had noticed I had real interest in reading books like Water for Chocolate, which is one of my absolute favorite books in the world. The book Chocolat, which the movie that was with Juliette Binoche and Johnny Depp was based on. And these books that really had these amazing descriptions of food. And food wasn't just kind of a byproduct. Food in many senses was the primary focus of the book itself. And I thought that was really interesting. And then there was, of course, a favorite book of mine called Heartburn by the late Nora Ephron, which I
Yeah.
had read after going through a breakup, one of many breakups with my ex. And there's so much wonderful food in that book. And I started kind of thinking, well, this would be kind of cool to write about, because I've always loved to write. I think reading, if you love to read, writing most often is sort of a byproduct of that. It was in my case anyway. And I had written a few articles here and there freelance throughout the years, but I thought, I blogging blogging had been, I think it really hit its, I think it's a big heyday in like the mid 2000s, so like 2011, 12, 13, those years. And so I kind of came in a couple of years after that. um, and I just started thinking, what do I want to write about, without having being restricted by, if I have to write to get paid, I have to write about something specific. And I thought, well, I want to write about books. I love books. I love book reviews, and I wanted to write about food. So I thought, well, I'll just do a blog about the food in different books. And it was also a good way for me to get more practice in my cooking because, I would not necessarily cook something that was a dish in the book itself, but I would take different references to food and combine them in different ways. So that was a lot of fun, and I just had a blast with it. I have a pretty good following. I think I have about 4,000 followers at this point. It's just a great joy to me. It's a creative outlet that I very much needed. And then and I still do it. I unfortunately don't have as much time to devote to it, but I do still blog quite a bit because I like the writing. And the Cooking the Books podcast kind of directly came from the blog. I wanted to
Right.
start podcasting and kind of get into that. I thought podcasting was really fascinating, and it's such a great way to get more information. It's like audiobooks. You can listen while you're doing other things, while you're doing housework, while you're getting ready to go to work, while you're cooking.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, it would be interesting to kind of take my blog structure and see how it translated into a podcast. And I had good time with it, but I decided I wanted to start having guests because I kind of got sick of the sound of my own voice. And so I started having different guests on. I had on one of my dear friends who's the director of the Grief Center here of New Mexico, which provides grief counseling and resources for kids who have lost a family member, generally through violence, sadly. And we talked about the movie and the book Pet Cemetery through the lens of grief, and how that book, really is a treatise on grief and what happens when you don't grieve properly. And but it's also full of food. And that kind of started me thinking about the concept of food and horror. And then I had met Allie, not met her, but I believe I started following her on Instagram about 3 years ago because, the words Gothic and cookbook. I thought, oh my God, my soul sister. I was, my separated at birth twin. And so I started following her, and I asked her if she wanted to be a guest on the Cooking the Books podcast. She came on and we had like the best conversations. We did these two full-length episodes, one on Dracula and one on Rebecca, which we both agree is probably one of our favorite books and movies of all time. And she spoke so eloquently just about the food, just her studies of food. She studied food in such an unique and unusual way that's so different from anything that I've had any experience with, that I was like, this woman, she's amazing. I wanted to kind of just stay in contact with her and see if she wanted to collaborate further. She was finishing her doctorate at the time, and I had started thinking about maybe doing another type of podcast. So I asked her if she was interested in doing a podcast that analyzed. Originally, we were going to do goth, and then I thought that's a little too specific. I thought, how about horror? Because as a reader, I notice that I read very in depth, and I've noticed that there are always mentions of food in horror, not in horror literature. And then you start watching movies and you start noticing sometimes that the food in the horror film is like a primary vehicle to move the plot forward. I'm thinking specifically of Drag Me to Hell. There's a scene where the main
Yeah.
character goes to dinner with her fiance and her fiance's parents, and she's got a lot of hangups about food in general, and the
Hmm.
movie explains that. But there's a scene where they're about to eat a piece of cake, and the cake has an eye, then an eye opens in the middle of the cake, and it's like this pivotal scene in the movie, and it's all about the food. So I started thinking, well, maybe we could start doing a podcast analyzing the horror genre through the lens of food. And so we started for Fear Feasts, and here we are.
You speak when you talk about horror and literature
Hmm.
with great authority, and I've wondered, are you an academic yourself? Are you like an
No,
academic?
no, I'm just a nerd who reads a lot.
Have you
Um,
considered it? Because I mean, I could see you teaching literature very
thank you.
easily. It'd probably be effortless for you.
I was in graduate school several years ago. It was just a struggle. I was helping take care of my grandmother who was sick at the time. I was going through a breakup in a relationship, and I had to financially didn't have the means to go to graduate school full time.
Right. It's
And you really
expensive.
have to. You know, graduate
Yeah.
school demands that you give it full time. And
Yeah.
I didn't was not in that position to do it. I've thought about it. Maybe I will. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe.
Are you considering writing any books yourself? I know Alessandra's got a book that's coming out. Are
Mhm.
you thinking about writing anything yourself?
I've thought about writing a book. I don't really know what I would write about. I've thought about a cookbook. And in fact, I had the idea of writing a cookbook based on the work of Stephen King, but somebody beat me to it.
Yeah.
That's okay though. It's a good book. You know, I don't know. Maybe I would love to. Allie and I have talked about doing a cookbook based on uh, Fear Feast. I think
Ah,
that's a great idea. You
that would
know,
be wonderful.
yeah, yeah. I think she needs to get past the Gothic cookbook stuff first and get that out there, and then I think we can
Yeah.
focus on it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd love to, and I love to write. It's just I think it's one of those things where I'm a little the thought of writing a book, it can be a little bit intimidating.
Yeah.
There's so many of them out there, and then the
Yeah.
publishing world has changed so much in the past 5 years. So yeah,
Yeah.
I have another friend. Her name is Crystal King. She's a published author. She wrote Feast of Sorrow and The Chef's Secret. And actually, she is somebody I collaborated with on her book, The Chef's Secret. She had, one of the marketing things that she had done to promote that book, she reached out to different cooking professionals in the country and food bloggers, and I was one of them, and asked them to contribute a unique recipe. And that was actually put in a cookbook that was published as a companion piece to the book itself. So that was a real honor. And she's given me a lot of tips on the publishing world and all that. And there's another podcast that I'm part of. It's called Sharing the Flavor. And I collaborate with two really great guys, Andy Gebby and Giovanni Franceschini. Giovanni has actually published two books, The Pasta Papers and Dinner at Shakespeare's Globe. And Giovanni, he's an amazing writer. He's also an academic as well, but he writes about food in conjunction with literature, and I think that's kind of how he and I connected as well. He's given me some ideas about the publishing world as well. It's just it's not something I know a whole lot about, and I think it would be fascinating to do a book. Like I said, it's just there's so much information out there. You really have to know what you're doing.
Now, you mentioned you were in another. How many podcasts are you involved with right now?
Well, I don't really do cooking the books much anymore. It's a little bit on hiatus. I think about getting it going again sometime, but with two full-time podcasts and a blog and a full-time job, it's kind of not really high on my priority list. So there's Fear Feast, which Allie and I, it's a labor of love. We love it. We look forward to it. And then I'm involved in Sharing the Flavor, which I'm a contributing host. I go on, it's primarily Andy Gebby's baby. He's a foodie, and he and Giovanni have known each other for many years. And I met Andy through Giovanni. He introduced me as a fellow food writer and blogger. So we've been doing that podcast for about a year. Been on a little bit of a hiatus over the past couple months, but we're gonna probably get started now in the next month again, going forward. Initially, the podcast started out as just talking about different specific foods specific to Italy, because Giovanni, his family roots are Italian, and so that's an area that he's very knowledgeable about. And so he's kind of teaching Andy and I as we talk. So we talked about tiramisu, we talked about al forno dishes, we've talked about cocktails, we talk about misperceptions about Italian food and Italian culture that a lot of like Americans and people from Britain tend to have. And then this second season that we're in now, we're doing kind of a road trip through Italy, sort of based on what Stanley Tucci did. Obviously, we don't have Stanley Tucci's budget, but
Well, yeah.
that was sort of the idea, and we've segued into trying to get guests on because there's such a huge, amazing world of Italian food writers out there that it's kind of mind blowing. So we have a really good time with that one as well, and that's a nice one because we get to try different cooking techniques as part of when we record. We each generally contribute a dish, and we'll pick pictures and show them off on social media. And so it's a really nice collaboration with two people who are passionate foodies like I am, just in different ways.
I love that. I mean, do you feel like Italian food's kind of coming into a renaissance right now? Because we're having a lot of people showing accurate
Yeah.
Italian food, whereas before we had the Olive Gardenization of
Hmm.
Italian food, which is we'll not be speaking about because it's horrifying. But
Thank God. I do definitely think we're seeing that. I think you could argue we're seeing that with a majority of food from different backgrounds and
yeah,
ethnicities. You mentioned New Mexican food,
yeah,
certainly, and then certainly there's an appreciation for the fact that it's specific to Italian food. Italian food is not just pasta and sauce.
right,
Italian food is so many other things, and there are 22 separate regions within the country of Italy, and each one has its own unique identity, and the food can be as varied as seafood in these regions along the coast to the area of Tuscany, which they tend to use. They have a term called cucina povera, which is literally poor people's food, and it's based on a lot of use of bread because bread was something everybody had. So bread has sort of been turned into this amazing ingredient that's used as a thickener for soups, that's used as a basis for meatballs. So it's a lot of things that I don't think people have ever really thought about. You think about maybe breadcrumbs, but not actual, like the use of soaking a piece of bread in milk or water, squeezing it out, and then using that textured bread as a basis for a really wonderful recipe. And then I think a lot of people are aware of there's the dichotomy between olive oil versus butter, and butter has tended to be much more used in the north because of the proximity of dairy cows in these mountainous regions along the border between Switzerland and France. Those have tended
yeah.
to have a lot more cows and cattle and things of that nature, but it's not so strict anymore. And with the influx of just different cultures immigrating to different countries, I think we're starting to definitely see there is a huge difference in regional cooking in from all countries. Even in like United States, there's a difference between cooking in the South, like the southern states, like Georgia, South Carolina, what you would think of as your traditional southern states, and then the cooking in the place like where I live, New Mexico, and then the cooking in the place like the, Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
So, I think it's just having the appreciation and the acknowledgement that yes, maybe we have a perception that certain foods are associated with certain countries, but we're realizing more and more that many different foods can be associated with a country in many different ways and from different regions within that country. And that's sort of what I think we're trying to do with sharing the flavor, is just share the fact that Italy, like most other countries, is not just one dish. It's not just one culture. It's not even necessarily just one language. It's many different foods and cultures and languages and identities.
Yeah, the lady from the Pasta Grannies on, and she was saying that
I
one,
love that. I love that show so much.
it's really good, and it's
Hmm.
just the people that are the guests are really the star of the show because
Hmm.
they're incredible. But she was saying that one town will have no knowledge of the cooking of a town next to them,
Hmm.
which is unthinkable in America because, but like
Hmm.
and I see this in Europe a lot where you'll have different accents in different towns that really are just, if it was California, it would
Hmm.
just be the town next over that because we commute so much, but they don't.
Sure.
So, and
Exactly.
it's so different there where, it's just different regional cooking and everybody has
Hmm.
different ways of doing things. Because
Hmm.
when I was a kid, all Italian food was meat gravy on spaghetti,
Hmm.
right? That was it.
Hmm.
Or lasagna.
Hmm. Oh yeah, spaghetti and meatballs.
That was it.
Yeah, exactly. I also think, and this is something that Giovanni, my other podcast partner, has mentioned, is oftentimes as well. A lot of it is there's a strong interest in maintaining that unique identity and that unique sense of self in these different places in Italy. That's their way of maintaining their identity, is keeping these specific recipes, keep putting them out there, of course, but that I think there's something to be said for that. Food is such an integral part of culture and identity that I do think it's important, even as much as we become multicultural and sharing our culture and our food throughout the world. I also think it's very important for us to maintain our own culinary traditions as a way to honor our culture and our identities.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
So to talk about Fear Feast a little bit,
Hmm.
how did you meet? You said you had Ali was on your podcast, and then that's how you guys
Hmm.
got to meet. When did
So
the talk about having Fear Feast come out?
It was right, I would say it was about a year and a half ago. She was right at the end of her finishing her PhD and she didn't have the time for it. But she said, that she loved the idea. And so I followed up with her and we kind of hashed it out and talked about how we wanted to go about it. Talked about different, what we would call the podcast, how we would break it up. And she had the very brilliant idea of breaking it into seasons based on the different subgenres of horror. So we've talked about satanic food, possession, satanic, demonic. Now we're in our season with haunted house food. We're going to do a segment on witches. We're going to do a segment on vampires. We're going to do a segment on ghosts, monsters, zombies, general, just, paranormal. We're probably going to do a season on slashers, which I think will be very entertaining. And I like that idea. I hadn't thought so specifically about breaking it into different seasons. And my original approach was to stick with the sort of the literature aspect of it. And she's the one that said, "Oh, I think it would be a great idea if we incorporated movies into it." And what's great about she and I is that we really complement one another on that. We're good podcast partners because she's much more of a movie aficionado, and she loves to read like I do, but she oftentimes will have much more background on the film as opposed to me who, I read voraciously. So, I have, and oftentimes there's areas where, I've read the book many more times than the film. So I'll have that insight and she's watched the film many more times. So she'll have the insight on that. And it's been a great collaboration.
I want to say, for the people that are listening, I want to mention you will often do something that I love so much, and which is you will compare and contrast where you can a movie and the book it's based on. Not It's not always possible. I think like House of the Devil, for instance, had no book.
Yeah.
So there are films where that can't be done, but with Rosemary's Baby, The Omen, so many of these t movies that were based on best-selling books, The
Hmm.
Exorcist, you
Hmm.
contrast them and compare them, and I just alone the Rosemary's Baby episode, I believe, should have, and I'm not trying to gush, but I think it should have won an award. It was so well done.
Thank you.
It could have been a university lecture. I mean, it was just
Hmm.
perfect
Hmm.
because you guys really went in depth on Ira Levin's book, and you talked about it, and you talked about the characters and how he wrote it, and then you
Hmm.
compared it to the wonderful film,
Hmm.
and it was just amazing. I really loved it so much.
Thank
You
you.
guys really give a lot of love, I think, and you show a lot of love. There's no dry talking about this. It's very, very passionate.
It's just something that we both love. We both are, like I said, we're avid readers, we're goth aficionados, we love horror, we love food and cooking, both of us. And it's just, and I think we both come at it from slightly different areas as well. Like she very much comes from the academic background, the literary analysis. That's something that when I was in graduate school, I absolutely hated. I refuse to do any kind of literary analysis now, so that's probably why I would never go back and get a degree, an advanced degree, but that's okay. But because to me, literary analysis takes the joy out of it. And
Yeah,
so, but I love that she is so well versed in it that she can, and she makes me think. It's like she definitely makes me up my game because she makes me think about things in terms of literature and horror and food that I had never thought about before. We did an episode recently on the wonderful movie Crimson Peak by Guillermo del Toro, and
hmm
she talked about the concept of weaponizing food, which I had never really thought about. But then I started thinking, my God, yes, absolutely. And then you start thinking, wow, food weaponization is not just what they're doing in this book. You can look back through history and see how food has been weaponized by incoming cultures. I think very specifically of the Spaniards coming to to the Americas
yeah,
and bringing certain diseases to the indigenous tribes. It's similar along those lines. Or you think about something like something as basic as sugar
yeah,
and how sugar has been harvested throughout the years. It's been harvested on the blood and sweat of slaves. That's a very, to me, that's as horrific a food reference as anything with a supernatural twist on it. So like I said, she's been really great for me to up my game. And I think she said the same thing with me. She said, I've helped her look at things in literature a lot more differently. And I've given her an appreciation for Stephen King, because I think Stephen King is like the best writer in the entire world. He's certainly one of my top five favorites. And so yeah, so I think, like I said, she and I are very good collaborators, and she's become a very dear friend as well. So I think, all, best of both worlds.
Now, you mentioned in the first, season you talked about the satanic films, and then you're
Hmm.
now working on in this season you're working on haunted houses. Is
Hmm.
that correct?
Yes, correct.
And any taste of what we're going to be seeing next season? You mentioned witches. Is that going to be one of them?
We haven't decided which specific subgenre we're going to do next. We're tossing about a few ideas. Could be witches, could be vampires, could
Ooh.
be ghosts, could be zombies, could be just monsters in general, could be general paranormal, could be who knows? Could be slashers. I don't know. We have some interesting things coming up. We have potential season coming up on dysfunctional families, terrible
Wow.
dads and bad moms. I think we're going to have a blast with that one
Yeah.
because that's going to have some huge tie-ins both with horror and with food because that's what families do. They traumatize one another and they have meals together. I mean, that's my family right there.
Yeah, that sounds accurate. Do you have any favorite episodes that you've done so far? I mean, you've had some really wonderful episodes, and I've
Hmm.
enjoyed every one of them. Do
Thank
you have
you.
any favorite episodes that you've done so far?
My personal favorite, okay, well, the one that came out today is my favorite so far. Today, the episode that came out today was The Shining, based
Oh
on
yeah.
Stephen King's amazing book and the Stanley Kubrick masterpiece film. Love that book. That book is in my top five of all books of all time. And I've read it at least 20 times. And I've seen the movie. I can't even tell you how many times. And in fact, I'll put it on as background music sometimes while I'm doing housework, if I'm cooking, or that's how much I love both the film and the book. Um, and we didn't even get into half of what we could have talked about specific to the film or the book. Today's episode is my favorite of all of the ones we've done. Rosemary's Baby is probably my second favorite for the reasons you mentioned. The third favorite one that I think we did is based on, we covered a movie called The Dark and the Wicked. Dark and the Wicked. I don't scare very easily because I've read so much horror and I've seen so many horror films. That movie scared the hell out of me. I was genuinely terrified. And Allie and I actually watched it together. We did a video share like what you and I are doing now. And I actually screamed in a couple, a couple of places, which is a little embarrassing, but that just goes to tell you. But I think what we both enjoyed about it is we got very much into the family dynamic in that movie, and you start to really analyze how much food is an integral part of everyday life and family life, and how it's used in certain situations, particularly when a family is grieving or going through trauma. And also in a more literary analysis sense, how what it says when the food itself is not present, but you're in these domestic situations, like sitting around at a kitchen table, taking this idea of something that's supposed to be the ultimate family togetherness activity, sharing a meal, and turning it on its head and using it to show the emptiness and the barrenness of this family, because that's what that movie is really ultimately about in the end, is family isolation and family trauma and generational trauma in many ways. So that to me is a definite favorite episode, The Dark and the Wicked. It's a well done. It's an incredibly good movie. It's not one I want to watch again for a really long time because it is so dark, but it's
Yeah.
such a good movie. Brian Bertino is such an amazing director.
We already talked about this a little bit, but I want to
Mhm.
kind of ask you a little bit more about it because you really are a fan of the written word in horror. Are there any other writers that you read right now that you're really enjoying their works that are horror writers or gothic horror?
Um, There's a writer named Sylvia Garcia Moreno who wrote a book called Mexican Gothic. I love that
Hmm.
book. That book is great. And it has so many wonderful Gothic elements. It's got the mysterious, spooky house, it's got the family secrets, it's got the potentially incestuous relationship between the brother and sister. It's just I really like her. And she's not just horror, but she's a wonderful writer, and I particularly like that book a lot. That was definitely a favorite. Um, I really like Stephen Graham Jones, and I
Yeah.
like what he has done because I this is something that I definitely see as a trend in horror literature is there's a lot more use of different ethnic backgrounds to showcase the trauma that and the horrors that people have gone through in this country specifically. There's another wonderful writer, Tanarib Due. She's an
Yes.
African American. Oh my God, she's amazing.
Yeah.
Victor Laval. He wrote a book called The Changeling. I like that because it was sort of based on fairy tales, and I love fairy tale horror. That's another season Ali and I are going to do, by the way, fairy tale horror.
Ooh,
I
nice.
know, right?
That'll be
Oh
some good
yeah.
ones for that one. Yeah.
But I like that these writers are using their own personal backgrounds and ethnicities to explore not just the horrors that they've gone through, as being people of a different, a non-white background in this country. And I love that they're using it as using a supernatural horror, or in Stephen Graham Jones's case, slasher horror, as a way to explore these really deep and important themes. I think for so many years, horror tended to be very just generic in the sense that it tended to be the done by, or at least it was promote the horror that came out was mainly by, white men. And again, Stephen King, I love Stephen King, and I think he's an example of somebody who you've seen his style evolve and grow over the years. He's much more, he writes, characters that I think are a lot more well-rounded. And I like that he gives more airtime, if you will, to characters from different backgrounds. That wasn't really the case with Stephen King. One of the characters I can think of is the character of Dick Halloran in The Shining. One of the first examples that I can remember of a man of color, a person of color, being one of the central characters in a book of horror by a white man. So I like that. I like to see that. I like that evolution, but I really like that we're seeing more of that. I love that, because I think it's much more reflective of the culture and the society that we live in. Everybody has gone through their trauma and everybody's gone through their horror, and some people have gone through a lot more of it than others have, because of the fact that they are of a different ethnic background. So I love seeing that, and I think it's a very valid way to showcase horror. I hope we see more of it. So, but definitely Victor Laval and Stephen Graham Jones they're phenomenal. The book The Changeling was so terrifying to me. I don't even have children, and that book terrified me. So,
Now, you mentioned Stephen King. Have you read his new book, Holly? Because it would definitely tie into Fear Feasts.
hmm no, I has not come yet. I try to support local bookstores, and my local bookstore, their shipment of it had gotten delayed. So I'm
Yeah.
gonna go probably buy it, probably in the next couple of days. Yeah. So I've been waiting to. I always tell myself I'm gonna wait and see if somebody gets it for me for Christmas, and I thought, no, I can't wait.
Well, food definitely plays a role in it. If you've heard anything
Okay.
about it, it's going to be a big tie-in. So
Okay. Oh, good. Okay. And I love her. I love the character of Holly Gibney. She's just so amazing.
I
I
do
know. I
too.
love that. I love that he has written such a strong female character. That's sort of been one of the criticisms leveled at him, is that he doesn't write people of different ethnic backgrounds very sensitively, and that he doesn't
No.
write strong female characters. I would take great issue with the issue of him not writing strong women, because I think his women most of the time are very strong. The character of Wendy Torrance was
Yeah.
a very strong character in the book. I hated what was done to her character in the movie, but we won't get into
Yeah.
that. I mean,
Yeah. It's a whole
even
different
Annie Wilkes,
podcast.
in Misery, Annie Wilkes was a fascinating female character.
Yeah.
Holly Gibney is amazing. The character
Carrie.
of Beverly in the book It, she's
Yeah.
amazing. She's a badass. So
You're going to like this one then. I think because Holly continues to progress and she grows strengths, and this is a big one for her, I think.
okay.
She's as big as character is in it as she was in The Outsider. In
Oh,
fact, she's
good.
the central character, so it's even
Okay.
better.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah, she's a great character. I love her.
Now, I know you don't watch as many horror films as you do read books, but do you have like a top 10 horror films?
Oh, I have a top 12.
Okay, top 12, even
So
better.
my first one is The Exorcist, of course, and I think The Exorcist is one of those movies that it's not even just horror anymore. It's part of the canon of great American films.
Yeah.
Get Out by Jordan Peele.
Ah,
Oh God, that
yeah, so
movie
good. I
I
think
is
one of the best horror films ever
amazing.
made.
Yes, I agree. And for so many reasons, tying in with what I was talking about previously with Victor Laval and Stephen Graham Jones, showing horror from the viewpoint of a person who has been traumatized generationally by institutional racism. And
Hmm.
to me, the best part of that movie though is the end. And I saw this movie; it was one of the few I've seen in the theater recently, not recently, but when it came out, and we literally cheered. Like we all stood up and were applauding at the end when his friend gets out of the car, his TSA friend, because you watching that movie against the backdrop of what's happened over the past several years of watching, young black men get killed by, white authority figures. I think everybody in that, I was terrified. I was like, I don't want to see this. I don't want to know. And then his friend shows up to save the day. I was like, ugh, like so uplifted. I love that movie. Jordan Peele, he's such a great director. I love him. Bram Stoker's Dracula,
Hmm.
specifically the version directed by Coppola. I love that.
Yeah.
That's so like beautiful and lush, and the colors and everything. And there's that classic line, I have crossed oceans of time to find you. I mean, come on now. That's Yeah, that's a great movie. There's a movie that came out in the 80s directed by Ken Russell called Gothic,
Yep.
and it
Yep.
supposedly tells the story of the summer when Lord Byron and Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley and Dr. John Polidori and Mary Shelley's sister, or stepsister rather, went to stay in this villa in on Lake Geneva. And of course, they were doing all sorts of crazy opiums and drinking, and who knows how many orgies they had, but whatever. But that's where Mary Shelley got the inspiration to write Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, and where Dr. John Polidori got the inspiration to write The Vampire. And this movie is just crazy. It's like over the top, has some trippy, great food references in it as well. But that's one of my absolute favorites. I remember seeing that in the 80s. There are a lot of kind of those weird, hyper real, kind of strange films coming out. And I just fell in love with it. And I've always had a thing for Gabriel Byrne. I still do to this day. And Julian Sands, may he rest in peace. An excellent, excellent movie. Crazy. Of course, there's The Shining, which we've already talked about. The movie's amazing. I think you could make an argument that the movie is a standalone entity from the book. To me, they're
Yeah.
so different from one another.
Very much.
And we get Allie and I get very much into that in this episode, but it doesn't take away from the movie at all. In fact, I think it should be a standalone because Kubrick was such a brilliant director, a misogynist, but a brilliant director. Friday the 13th, the first one, it has a very special place in my heart. I saw it when I was young, and I was a preteen, I think, when I saw it. And of course, when you're a preteen, you have all those crazy hormones running around. And Kevin Bacon was in it, and he was hot.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, and I just have very fond memories of watching it on my friend's cable, because she was rich, and so she had cable back then. We didn't have cable. We had three channels, and that was it. So we'd always go to her house to watch MTV, and you know she had she had all that. So that was we always remember Friday the 13th very fondly. So yeah. Salem's Lot, which I think we had already talked about. The
Yeah, the
scene with the kid,
original.
the scene with the kid floating, and you can't beat that. I mean, it's the scariest to this day. But then the scene in the book is just as scary in a different way. And I loved in the book how the character of Mark Petrie, he's able to fight it off by like, he takes his little his little
Yep.
monster figurines, and he holds up the cross. Like wow, I'm gonna try that next time a vampire shows up at my house. Love that movie, so good. American Psycho, as we talked about, the movie and the book. Not that it's necessarily horror, although I think it is, but because it's satire.
Yeah.
It's just yeah, it's a great movie. It really, really is. The second Aliens, not the first one, the second Aliens.
Right.
I love that movie. It has some great lines of dialogue. It was my dad's favorite. He had a huge crush on Ripley, and he had it on VHS. This tells you how long ago it was that I first saw this movie. And so my sister, my dad, and I would sit down and watch it. And to this day, my sister and I, like, we can literally quote that movie line by line. We're all gonna die, man. We're all gonna die.
Bill
It's
Paxton, rest in
great.
peace.
Rest in peace. I know, right? That was great. Love that movie so much. Suspiria by Dario
Ah,
Argento. Oh,
yeah.
anything in the giallo genre is a favorite. The colors, the weird, bizarre murders, but Suspiria is probably my favorite, and a fantastic witchcraft movie as well.
Did
But
you see the
I
remake?
think I did. I still like the original better, but
Yeah.
this remake was really good, and I liked Dakota Johnson in it. It was better. She was really good in that. It was way better than 50 Shades of Grey. Horrible, horrible movie.
The
Uh,
soundtrack for the sequel is very good.
oh, okay. I'll have to check it out.
It's by
Yeah.
Tom York from Radiohead. He did it. It's really good.
Oh, okay. I think Allie mentioned that to me when we were talking about doing a season of our podcast on the Giallo. genre. Okay, thank you for that. That's good to know. Angel Heart, another 80s movie with Robert De Niro and I just went blank. Mickey Rourke.
Uh, yeah, and
Lisa Bonet.
Lisa Bonet. Yeah,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
wonderful film.
Oh
I'm
yeah.
so glad you talked about that one because I love the book.
Mm-hmm.
I own the book, and I love it
Mm-hmm.
so much. It's such a
Yeah.
good book.
Falling Angel. It's a wonderful book. I love that book too. And did you know there was a sequel?
I never read it. Now I'm looking to find it and get a copy because I really
Mm-hmm.
want to read the sequel now. I'm surprised there's a sequel because the ending of the first didn't really lend itself to one. So I'm
No.
interested to see what
Well,
happens
the
in the
ending of
sequel.
the first movie didn't. That's
Yeah,
the great thing about the difference between the book and the movie. In the book, it ends with him getting arrested. And
yeah,
that's it. And that's it. And so, not to spoil it for you, but obviously since there's a sequel, he's still around.
yeah.
So it basically starts with him escaping from the police and it goes on from there. And I won't tell you anymore, but yes, if you can it's called Angel's Inferno.
Okay,
And
I'll
you
check
could
that out.
probably find it, I mean, on Amazon. I found it used on
Yeah,
Amazon. So yeah, and then another like back to the 90s movie is Flatliners. That's a great movie.
that's a good one too. Yeah, it was such a great cast in that one too.
Well, another Kevin
Anything with
Bacon movie. Kevin Bacon been in some favorite horror films. Stir of Echoes is another one that comes to mind. Obviously
yeah,
Friday the 13th, but yeah. So no, I just love Flatliners, and it was it touched me in a lot of ways because there's a storyline in there where Julia Roberts' character has lost her father, and I lost my father pretty young, and it was not the same circumstances, of course, but it was. I saw it only just a couple of years after my dad passed, so it always kind of stayed with me, and I just love the idea of going to the other side and making amends for things that you did and coming back and being able to get your life on the right track. I definitely think there's a strong sense of a morality tale in that movie, and I think that's part of why I like it. Also, it's very scary. That little kid in the red jacket chasing after Kiefer Sutherland.
very
Yeah.
good.
Mm-hmm. So there's my list of 12.
So one last question: if you're going to have a
Mhm.
dinner party and invite 10 characters from different horror films to it, and who would you invite and what would you have?
I love that question so much. So I'm gonna do like a full, like 4 or 5 course meal here. So I think we're gonna start with probably gonna start with father. The people I would invite would be Father, the two priests from The Exorcist, Father Karras and Father Marin, Jack and Danny Torrance,
Nice,
Count Vlad Dracula and Van Helsing,
nice,
Lord Byron from Gothic. Speaking of angels, Harry Angel and Louis Cypher, and then
nice.
Frankenstein's monster. So I think we're going to start with, in honor of The Exorcist, we'll start with some split pea soup. And since I and since I think I don't know why, but I have it in my head that Lancaster Marin is of Irish descent. I could be wrong. But we could also do some Irish blue cheese crackers that look like communion wafers, being
Nice.
the priests. I think that's pretty inspired. Um, as like a nice little appetizer for Harry Angel and Louis Cypher. We could have some hard-boiled eggs minced over some steamed asparagus, since eggs are a
Nice.
big thing in the movie. We could start with a nice bowl of tagliatelle and a tomato cream sauce for Lord Byron, since there was that scene with the big bowl of pasta in the movie Gothic, which love that, love that. For Frankenstein's monster, I think in his honor, because he is a vegetarian, I think I would do a nice vegetable gratin casserole.
Nice.
And then in honor of Count Vlad and Van Helsing, we'll just do a nice, rare, very bloody steak with lots of spices from Eastern Europe, since both of them are sort of from that area. And then for dessert, in honor of Danny and Jack, I thought we could do a nice big bowl of vanilla ice cream with a Kentucky bourbon reduced syrup on top.
Nice. I
Hmm.
love that. That is wonderful.
Thank you.
Vanessa, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I've so enjoyed getting to
Thank
talk
you,
to you.
Dean.
As
This was a great pleasure. I love your podcast as well. You've had some amazing guests.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I
I really
enjoy
love
doing
your
it.
podcast.
Thank you. You're very generous. Thank you. And I want to urge people to listen to the podcast Fear Feasts. We're going to have a link in the bio, and you can access it there. You really have to go back and binge listen to the whole thing because it's delectable. Vanessa, I'll
Well,
let you
you're
go.
so kind.
Thanks for
Thank you,
being on the
Dean.
podcast.
I really appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
That was my conversation with the wonderful Vanessa Baca. You can listen to her podcasts, Cooking the Books and Fear Feast, by going to links in the bio. You can also go to her blog. We have links in the bio for that as well. I know that you'll enjoy it. Coming up tomorrow is my conversation with TikTok star Jeremy Sheck to talk about his new book, Sheck Eats, Cooking Smarter, Friendly Recipes with a Side of Science, and that'll be tomorrow. Until then, I hope you're going to have a wonderful Halloween, a wonderful week, and until next time, I'll see you at the library.